All right, in this unit, we're going to take a look at what's called the MVC pattern. In a way, it's a methodology, but not really, it's a pattern. Remember, we saw in Programming Logic Intermediate the three-tier model for how to build desktop apps that distinguish between the GUI and the business class and the database. This is similar to that, but it's a little bit different. Many of you were in the iOS class yesterday, and in there Sean talked about the three-tier model and how it's been tied into iOS apps. Not tied in, according to him. Apple claims they created this MVC pattern / model. I don't care. And what's in there is definitely a little different than what we're going to use in our web-based environment. The pattern is just a way to organize our files and to organize our development so that we can swap pieces out relatively easily. We're going to use the MVC pattern in our systems project. It also allows us to do parallel development. So we can divide stuff up and say, okay, you work on this chunk and you work on that chunk and you two work on that chunk, and all work in parallel. And then ultimately, with any luck, bring it all together. Okay. So that's kind of where we're going here. Here's my little slideshow that tells us all about it. Right. We have a user on a client computer. We have a database or a server that has a database on our server. Okay. And at some point, the user of this computer is going to say, go to my MVC website. When that happens, here's what occurs. MVC stands for Model View Controller. The pattern includes 3 components. And because it's a web-based thing, it actually includes more than that. But for the logic of the program, for the most part, everything's embedded inside these 3 components. There's a controller. The controller is your index file. It's the only controller. Now, I've seen other, and I've even thought about creating others where there are multiple controllers, but really what happens is you pick one and you end up in one place. For instance, when we do Lions Camp, we may very likely have 2 controllers, one for admin, one for campers. Okay. We could have done that in Sheila's, but Sheila's project graduation was small enough that we decided just to lump it all together. So we can have more than one controller, like we do in iOS, right? Because every one of those screens has its own controller behind the scenes. But in our web-based one, we're going to have one controller. Every single request from the server goes through that controller. That's why it's called the controller. It controls every single request. In addition to the controller, we have bunches of views here. Those are like forms or just separate web pages. And there can be hundreds of those. It can be a form for getting a new record, a form for updating a record, a form for just displaying records. There can be I'm sorry, I said forms, I should say view here. It can be as many views as you want. Every page that's different gets its own view. Then in addition to that, there's also the model files. The model files are just like your business class files, except for one thing, the way we're implementing it here. And by the way, my implementation comes from Merrick. Right. In a web-based environment, we don't often create objects because we don't typically need to store large amounts of data along with the processing that goes along with it. That's what an object is, right? A bunch of data members and then all the processing. In our case, what we're typically going to have are libraries of methods, just the methods. And the way Murak recommends and I recommend we break this up is on a table-by-table basis. Now, initially, we're not going to have any database tables. That doesn't happen until Unit 6. But what we'll do in Lions Camp is for every table, we'll have a model library. Here's all the methods that apply to the camper table. Here's all the methods that apply to the camp table. Each one of those will be a different library. There's no data in there. They're just methods. So it's a little bit different than the 3-tier model. There's no data, just the methods, and we put them in their own separate files. So those are the three components. I'm going to show you all this and how they tie together. That's the goal of this unit, and nothing helps like experience. Systems will help a lot. So the client computer makes a request, sends an HTTP request. Along with that HTTP request, in most cases, an action is sent. It's basically just a menu choice. What do you want to do next? And what we have to code in the controller is code for every single action that we expect to get. So if the action is display a list of campers, I know that's a big long term, we'll shorten that. Camper display, probably. If all we want is a list of campers, then the action would say display camper list or something like that. Then in the controller somewhere there is code that knows how, because we code it, knows how to get the appropriate data for that list, and then which view to stuff that into so that it looks pretty on the screen. And then there will be dozens of other actions that we have to deal with. In our first unit here, 3, we only have 2 actions that we're going to deal with. But in Lions Camp, there are going to be dozens. There were dozens in Project Graduation. There were dozens last year with the Wisconsin Rapids School District orientation stuff that we did. And there are often dozens of different actions that we respond to. Each one of those actions typically needs some data. To get data, just like in a 3-tier model, you send the request to a model file, basically calling a function saying, I need this data. That function has in it SQL. The SQL generates a data set. And this connects here to whichever one of these is appropriate. How do we know? Based on the action. The action tells us which model or models, sometimes it's more than one, we need to access. The controller itself doesn't get any data, but it coordinates the getting of the data, and then it holds it. The model file, whichever one it is, then sends that data back. And the controller hangs on to it. And then the controller figures, okay, now I have all my data. Which view am I supposed to use to display that data? And again, that's all based on that action variable that's disappeared from here. So we send the action variable down and we collect the appropriate view, whichever one it is. We then merge the two together. Here's a pile of data. Here's a view. This data is supposed to go into that table. We write there's PHP in these views, just enough to display data though. The data getting is done by the controller. Technically, it's done by the model who passes it to the controller. Our views here, remember our forms in Programming Logic Intermediate didn't do any processing, it just displayed stuff. Very little processing. Mostly display. A little bit of key press stuff because we could figure that out. But most of the logic was in here. Same thing will happen if we generate a form and the data gets sent back. We'll call a model file to validate that. And if it's valid, we'll send back a signal saying it's valid data, and we display the valid data. If it's bad, we put the form back on the screen, said this, and this is crummy, fix it. So all of that happens, and then once we put it all together, then the data gets sent back and displayed. Somewhere on that page there's a link, maybe 3, maybe 4, maybe there's a button. You click on the button and a new action is sent to the controller. The controller says, oh, for that action I need this data and this data and this data and this data, collects it. I'm going to stuff it into that view and sends it back again, and we just go into this cycle. But if you look at this carefully, there is only one web page in this site. The controller. The controller morphs itself to display the most recently requested page using one of these views. This controller is actually an index page. It is a web page that has nothing in it. When you say, give me action number 1, it comes down here and grabs the HTML and the PHP for 1, and it basically inserts it into the index page. then puts the data where it belongs and sends it back. So whenever you're using one of these MVC models, you always look like you're looking at the index page. Even if you've navigated what seems like 6 levels deep, you're still, the address at the top is still index. And every time we change pages, we send a different action. Sometimes actions cause other actions just on their own. But there's only one page that morphs. The index page morphs, takes on the properties of all the other views in the website.
In a web-based environment, that seems better because somebody can't type in an address to bypass things.
It's very difficult to bypass. If they're smart, they can type in their own, you'll see, you can type in your own action variables. Right? And if they type in their own action variable, then we could effectively bypass and jump to one of these, kinda. But when we get to Unit 7, our security, because it's centralized in the controller, it is relatively simple and more secure. There is no way, if we code it right, for you to jump into one of these and bypass the security of the system. The login screen, for instance, because we'll write the code to say if they've logged in, then let them go where they want to go. Even if they manually type their action variable, they're logged in, let them go. If they're not logged in, then take them to the login screen. No matter what they ask for, take them to the login screen until they log in. That's what we're going to learn how to do in Unit 7. So I'll probably refer back to this picture a couple of times, but remember that central controller that morphs. It collects the data it needs, it then puts that into a view that it inserts into the index page and sends it back to the client. Most of the time, this is going to these model library files, contain lots and lots of functions. We just call the functions that we need. In this unit, we're not quite ready for functions yet. That's the next unit. So in the next unit, we'll learn how to write the functions and we'll create these library of PHP functions. In the meantime, I'm just going to throw some code in there. Questions? Okay, let me just minimize that, keep it handy in case I want to get back to it. I have renamed the page that we're looking at. This is the one we ended up with in Unit 2. Might have a few tweaks to it, might be slightly different, but if you downloaded Unit 3, it should look like this. And if I run it, I hope my local host is still running. Yep. It's the same one we had before. And if we click on Show Total Weight, it shows us the total weight, same way we did it before. That's our starting point. Now this is a bit of a misnomer because normally when you create an MVC model, you don't start with a regular old page that links to another regular old page. You start with the MVC model. This actually has, remember, 2 pages in it, right? It has my index page and my results page. All that's still there. But these are now going to get turned into views, and all that's going to be left when we're done is an index page with some PHP in it. So the models have PHP libraries. I said that there's no HTML in there. It's all PHP. Now the PHP that's in there may generate HTML. That might happen. But generally these model files are functions that gather data and return it. Or if it's an update function, sends data to the server, say here, save this, update this record, and then collects the fact that it was successful or not. Hopefully it should be successful. Unit 5 is when we finally get into these model files. Then there are views, talked about those. Then the controller uses the action variable. The user requests information from the site. Yeah, I think I said all this. That's a good review. Index page uses the action variable to determine what data. Sends the data request to the model. The model passes the data back. Now that's not just one request. That could be 3, 4, 5 requests. I might need to fill the combo box on my cabin form that says which campers are in here. Or I'll just flip that around. Which cabin has my camper been assigned to? Well, I need a list of cabins. Well, that comes from the cabin table. But the rest of the data is all about campers. So that comes from the camper table. And there may be another lookup and another lookup that I want to drag data in from. The controller gets all that data first. And when I say the controller gets all that data, you know how that magic happens, right? We do it. We write the code and say, I need this, 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 and this to deal with this request. And then here's how it's going to be displayed. We still have to do the HTML pages with PHP embedded to display that data. Get the model, the database returns it, the index file passes the data to the appropriate view. I need to rephrase that. It merges the two. The view's then sent back, and the index page morphs. Okay, there's some example controllers in the book, but what I've actually modified the controller. What we discovered a couple of years ago is that the controller, if we have cases for every single thing that we want to deal with, there's so many cases that it is hard to navigate. So I have figured out a way to make the controller simple so that the controller only brings in the switch cases, case statements. It only brings in the cases that it needs for the current request. I'll show you how to do that. It's a modification that I have made to simplify the controller because our controllers were getting out of hand. So the controller's is the heart. It's Grand Central Station. Everything goes through it. It includes a bunch of case files. We're going to see that. And each case figures out what data I need. If there's variables, it'll pull them out, send them to a method. The method saves them in the database. The controller, Grand Central Station, everything comes through it. It'll call validation functions if it's appropriate, does all the update, read, delete stuff, and creates a new page. The controller doesn't usually contain any HTML, it's all PHP. Well, all of the HTML is included in the view files. Unless it's created dynamically, then it's sort of coming out of the model. The model generates HTML, or generates HTML using PHP. That occasionally happens, but most of the HTML is in the view file. So that's another thing we're separating. Remember in the second unit I mentioned that what we're trying to do here is maybe allow people who don't know PHP to develop beautiful looking web pages, and then simply plug the PHP in where it goes. And all the PHP programmers like you and I could do the model stuff. Still think that's really great in theory, but it doesn't always work out because in some of the pages I've shown you my book list, the page itself is very, very small. There's a PHP loop that generates a table on the fly. Now, it's not pretty. If we needed to make it pretty, maybe I'd bring somebody in and figure out a way to do that. All right, first thing we need to do is organize our pages, our website, in a different way. I'm going to add more organization. So if you're trying to follow along, I'm going to add some new folders now. We have no place to put our model files. So I'm going to add a folder called models or model. Let's see, do I want model or models? I forgot already. I'm pulling a Sean over on the side. I have the completed project so I can refer back to it. Model, okay, singular. And then we also have the view folder. And if you make these plural, just be consistent because what's in here is a lot of models. What's in here, the next folder is going to be a lot of views. Again, I make them lowercase just to make my life a little easier when I'm typing. We already have a CSS folder, we already have an images folder, we already have a JavaScript folder, so now we're adding new folders to deal with this MVC model. The MVC view files are typically stored in the views folder. Now it's plural, good. In the views folder. I'm just cheating looking at my index file over here. I should probably show it to you as well. But just want to make sure that I'm on I got everything straight here. I I hate to be inconsistent. Yeah, I'm inconsistent. Let's make them plural. In the example that I have from last year, it's the model folder and the views folder. That's not good. Singular doesn't sound right. There's got to be a lot of models in here, and there's going to be a lot of views in here, so we'll just put S's on. Okay, that makes a little more sense. The way we bring this stuff in from one place to another to morph this index page is by using an include statement. This is different than the include statements you've seen everywhere else. The include statements we saw in Swift and we saw in programming logic. There it's uses, I think, or no, uses is Swift and include, wherever they are. Okay. What those do is bring in predefined code. What the include statement in PHP does is it brings in predefined views that are literally picked up character by character and stuck in your code right here where you put them. So the order that you do these things is important. In Swift, in programming logic, and C#, you could rearrange your uses statements however you want. As long as you bring the code in before you use it, it works. With the include statements, wherever you put the include statement, any HTML generated by that is plugged in right there where you put it.
It's practically a giant variable.
It's a giant variable. I like that. It returns a giant variable that has a bunch of HTML in it. It could have PHP in it as well. The error page there, or the employee cases, could have PHP in it. But that code is literally picked up and pasted in there. So it's a little different than the models. When we bring in the models that have functions with code in them, then we use a require statement to bring those in. I require that model and the code that comes with it. I use those two distinctively that way. I think they work very much the same way. It still brings in the functions and kind of plops them in there.
So on your index page, is that more or less where you would keep the skeleton of your site, like if you have the same border across the top, or
no, it doesn't go into the index page. You're talking about the header and the footer and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah, if you keep all that stuff the same, does that go into index? Because are those views getting injected into that index?
Ultimately, yes. Do I put the headers and footers actually in the index? The answer is no. I put the headers and footers in each one of my views. So I have this view that says, oh, I need this header, it gets plugged in. I need this footer, this gets plugged in. Then there's more HTML in the middle, and that all gets plopped into the index page. Okay. So the index page, what it really has is a whole list of cases. We'll see them in a little while here. A whole list of cases that tell us how to respond to the actions. That's all that's there. Ultimately, what happens is we respond to the actions by collecting the data, merging it with the views to create this big index page that gets sent back. But the views themselves bring in the common stuff as well. Harold?
I was just going to say that, while I understand what he's saying, I think if I understand it right, you would have like a view for your borders and your title bar and
no.
You have all that,
okay.
And you would plug that in along with whatever else.
Right. What you'll see when we get to it, let me see if I can find one. Right here, this says include from the model file. This model file, real? That's a mistake. That's probably views. No, these are cases. I'm sorry. Got behind. Got ahead of myself. Okay, here we go. Here's a switch statement. It says, if I want the employee details, now there's no example here, but what you would see at the very end of this is include the employee details view. Just that one file. So what does that do? It sucks in all the PHP HTML from the employee details view, all of it. But what the employee details view also includes is a link to the header. So the view can include its own subviews, if you will.
So you still only have like one, because I was thinking you would have to go through every view and change your header if you wanted to change, if you wanted to change courses to classes
right.
on yours.
No, I changed it in one.
File, okay.
Yeah. The downside to this is what if I do have some pages that don't need the header? Then you have a second kind of header, and you define two headers, and you incorporate the appropriate one.
So your view would have the PHP to insert the variables, and in the case statement, you would load the variables with the data. So in the view was,
The data happens first, right?
and then the view would ask for it and display correct.
Because remember, this is PHP. So if I define a variable here saying, it's an array of cabins. I get an array of cabins. Then the view, somewhere in the HTML says, for each one of the cabins, bring it in, create a option in my combo box for that cabin. Another loop, create another option for this cabin, another option, another option, another option. And we put that in a loop. So it's a little 5-line code that creates this big, huge combo box if we wanted to. But all that stuff gets blended when we bring the page in. But this case typically, I don't even want to say typically, I want to say always calls one view. Which view do you want? That's it. I need basically that page. Index page, make me the employee details page. Well, takes the whole page, brings it in. And if that page has common components like a header and a footer or a nav bar or whatever you're using, you include those in the appropriate places in the view. So views can have subviews like a header, like a footer, like a nav bar. And that way, if you change your nav bar, you can change it in one place only.
So each view would also know how to make a request of the next.
Not just how to make which request depends on the buttons. There could be
But
links.
that's all in
There's
the view.
yes, every page has a way to navigate to the next action view. If I click on this button, cancel, then it goes back to the list. Remember we said that the button name gets transferred when you submit a form. The button name goes too. Well, I could have 3, 4 buttons, and the save button says take my data, save it. The cancel button says never mind. It's all in the same form. They're both submit buttons. Somehow I need to know which one caused it.
So
We use the
this
name.
has to be very carefully modularized. If you have 5 views that all have the same group of buttons, you want to have those as a separate.
Not necessarily. Yeah, if they're I don't
generic.
include buttons. Every view has its own set of buttons that are hard coded, and I've never gotten to that stage where they all have the same thing, because generally the action from page 1 to cancel is a different action than page 2 cancel. They're different actions, so I need to code those buttons differently, so there's really nothing to bring in there to share. All right, let's not get too deep into this here. We're still on the overview. So this is how I bring pieces in think of it as inserting code here. I believe the require statement does pretty much the same thing. It inserts a list of functions here, but I picture that more as leave the functions there, I'm just going to call them. But I think they get plugged in here as well. And remember, the functions are all PHP, so when the page is done, they disappear anyways. They're only there while we're building the page on the server. Then all the PHP disappears. But these are very important that you insert them in the right spot. All right. Typically include PHP and HTML, all kinds of stuff inside there. There's a third option. I mentioned it here just so I can find it later, and that's a header command. What the header command says, sometimes you have one action that when it's done, like save, wants to instantiate or start a different action. There is no way in a switch statement to jump from one to the other. And so what the header command allows us to do is basically say, I'm done with this case. Now go do whatever display list is supposed to do. It invokes one case from inside of another. It's the way I envision it. What it really does is goes back to the server, even though I'm on the server, goes back to the server, so take me to the index page with this action, which builds a whole new page. So this will come into play later. One thing to recognize here is not real easy to see, but there is a dot right there. PHP, and particularly its include files here, make use of some old DOS notation. Dot and dot dot. We've seen that in HTML, right? The dot dot at least, to take me back one folder level. The dot command says current folder. Well, why would I want to put a dot there? Why would I want to go to the current folder? Because when you go to the current folder, if there's an index.php file there, poof, it uses it to launch. And guess what? In our MVC model, there is only one. And so when we say dot, it basically says, take me to the index. Now, what's the action here? There isn't one. Ugh. That's okay. We're going to write code to automatically define a default action. So if the user goes to volkergall.com, books read. Well, that's a folder. What does it do? It launches my index page. With which action? They didn't say. So there's always a default action, which in my case is display the book list, or the login page, or whatever it is you're doing. We'll define a default action. So occasionally I take advantage of this to say, wherever I am, take me back to the home page. Because that's what this would do. There's no action. Big important note. This is confusing. When you're including other files and folders and images, and if you have links to other pages, which by the way doesn't happen anymore. You don't link to other pages in your site because there are no other pages. There's just the index page. You have to, if you want to link to a different view, provide the appropriate action. But what if you want images? What if you're putting in include files? Everything is coming from the index page. Everything. Every single view is coming from the index page. So when you build your index page, where are your images? In the images folder, period. No dots, no dot images. It's just, everything is an index. So when you're linking to an image, it's always as if you were in the index page. And that's a little confusing initially.
But it's simpler.
It's definitely simpler. All the dots are gone. They're pretty much gone. Because the only place you're ever starting from is index, and it has the views of all the folders that are inside it. So that's an important thing to keep in the back of your mind. I'll hit it again when we talk about it. Big important note, this is lesson learned. Don't include blank lines at the beginning or end of your include files. I'll mention this again when we get there. We start creating these libraries in your include files. On my Linux server, my Fat Cow server, if there's blank lines at the beginning or the end, it chokes on them. Causes an error, doesn't display the error message because in the meantime, different stuff has gone on the screen and it just doesn't work. And it was a nightmare because it works fine locally. When I run it on localhost, it works fine because it's a Windows machine. But as soon as I put it on my server, that blank line at the end, that one, I can't, I don't even want to think about the debugging I went through to figure out that the blank line was causing trouble. I'm not sure I was able to debug it. I think it was just luck of the draw. Why does this one work and that one doesn't? There's a blank line. It can't be. Well, let's take it. Oh my God. So that's kind of scary. As I mentioned before, as we get into this deeper and deeper and deeper, all of a sudden your controller has cases upon cases upon cases upon cases. And we can organize them, but it's still a real pain to scroll through them. So a technique that I've come up with is to have, here's an action. Okay, actually this is an action. Employee details is an action. Employee save is an action. Those are samples of actions. Here's trip details, trip save, trip list. Those three are pretty common. I want to see a list of all the employees. I want to see the details for the one I just clicked on. Change. I want to save those. Right? Those are examples of actions. What technique that I've come up with is that for every action that you define, you must define a table name at the beginning of it. This is a list of the employees. This is the list of the employee. This gets me the employee details for one employee somehow, the action. But notice the table name is always at the beginning. Because we're going to want a list of trips. We're going to want to edit trips, and so on. So I always put the table name at the beginning, and then I write a case statement that says, check to see if the word employee is at the beginning of my action variable. This is string pos, the position in the string of this variable, or of this literal. Yes, it's hard-coded. It's my table name. If I ever change my table name, I go change a few cases, I'm good. Okay. But what this is saying is, does the action start with the word employee? String pos returns the location. If it's not there, it returns false. If it is there, it returns its index. So what I'm asking is the word employee triple equal to 0? Why triple equal?
Because it has to be 0, it can't just be true.
It can't just be true. It can't be, if it's false, what do we get? 0. This is unlike some of the other index ofs that return -1s if they don't find it. This one returns false. And that was causing us some grief by adding an extra 0 here. That means not only is it 0, but it's not the false 0, it's the number 0. It's the exact same type as this. Right? So that triple equals is important here. Otherwise, if it doesn't find it at all, this will match true if you use a double equal sign. And that caused some grief, and that one wasn't too tough to track down. Go, why is it going in here? Because it's false. Oh, jeez. Triple equals. So notice what happens here. If it's true, then I include, remember that brings in PHP or HTML. In this case, it's PHP. Okay. I literally include in here all of the cases for employee actions, all of them. Employee lists, employee details, employee saves. I plug them in.
Is that a whole other switch statement then?
Yes. It cannot be cases. I can't put cases inside of cases. And I can't include cases. I tried that, doesn't work. Can't include half of a structure like a switch statement. So what I'm including here is a whole nother switch statement. It says, okay, I know it starts with employee, but which one is it? Employee list, employee details, employee save, employee delete. Which one is it? If it doesn't start with employee, does it start with trip? If so, bring in the trip cases. And when you do, we'll start processing those. Okay. So this is my dream thing. You won't see this in Murak because he doesn't have anything that's quite that big, and when he does, it falls over 3 pages and he doesn't care. But man, when you're trying to edit that later, trying to find your way through the code, I find it painful.
This would make it.
So what I'm doing is creating a case statement that first figures out which table am I messing with. And then inside of here are all the cases that are related to trips. I process that to figure out which one of those cases it's supposed to be or which one of those actions is really there. Sheila?
When did you change this?
When did I change what?
Because the file I downloaded says views instead of model.
I haven't, the stuff we haven't done yet, these are not views. When did I change? Page 5 says views.
Yeah.
I updated notes today, but I didn't change that significantly.
Huh. Because mine says
Maybe,
views.
are you on the right page? Page 13 or 5
Yeah.
of 13?
5 out of
It says views?
views.
I'm looking at my website. What are you looking at?
You.
Try a refresh. Just press F5, see if you've got an
Yeah.
old file or I don't know what you might have there.
Okay.
But these are different. These are not views. And they're not models because they don't include functions for how to. All they are case statement. It's a switch statement embedded inside there. It's just a switch statement. Now I put them in the model folder. That's why I was a little bit confused. I put them in the model folder. A little bit later, I tell you that if you wish, maybe to keep all your models in one place and your cases in another, maybe you create a cases folder and stick them in there. Doesn't matter where you put them. In my model folder, what you'll normally see is employee cases and employees. So the employees have all the functions, the employee cases have all the cases. Those are the only 2 that are ever in there.
What are the cases again?
The cases are other really switch, it's another switch statement that sorts out which employee action did they ask for. This question said, did they ask for an employee action? Does the action start with employee? If it does, then get me the switch statement that has all of the employee actions in it. We'll see these.
So that would have a switch statement based on action, and it would.
Yeah, and we're actually looking a little bit ahead here because this is unit, I don't remember when I start plugging these in here, probably unit 2 or 4 or 5.
And what's the action? The action variable?
The action is a variable that I use to communicate from one page to the other. Notice it has a $sign on it. that I use to communicate from one page to the other, what do you want to do next? What does the user want to do
So
next?
like if you click on a button that says purchase, it would go.
It
back
sends
there
a
to
secret
purchase,
hidden
just
action
like that.
variable. Yep. Every single one, every single time I have a link or a button that takes me from one page to the next, or a menu item or whatever it is, every single one of those has to have an action embedded in it. Unless you want the home page, then you can just leave it blank and take the default action. That's the only exception to that. But every other button, link within my page is really just an action. And they all link to the same place, the index page, with a different action. And then the index page looks at the action and said, okay, I need this stuff, which is this thing, here's what I do. It's kind of like magic.
Okay, so where would this switch statement be?
This switch statement is embedded in a file called employeecases.php.
Oh,
That
I'm talking about the,
In the index.
this switch statement is in index.
okay.
That one we will definitely see. Notice it's switch true, right? So only one of those is ever going to occur. We're only ever going to include one of these at any given time. Doesn't matter because it's all PHP. It's going to disappear anyways. Okay, but it's very efficient. Doesn't take up a whole lot of room. Before, my index page was like this, and it had a ton of code. Now, if we were to look at it, we can't see it, but now the way I envision it is it's this case statement with a bunch of code here, but the rest of it never even got sucked in. So it should be a little more efficient. I do add a default case down here. In case, this is for us programmers, if we send an action that we misspelled employee, it'll go, never heard of it. And you can look at the error message and go, oops, and you know exactly where to fix it. Each case checks to see what the action variable starts with. We said that. Okay, what does it start with? And then it includes a brand new switch of choices later. Starts with, okay, require statements. Here's what it might look like inside the cases file. I believe that's the cases file. Yes. Here's the cases file for table employees. If the action starts with the word employee, 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 then this one up here, sorry, I'm flipping a little quickly here. This one up here said, grief, get me the cases for employees. Then we include this file, which has its own switch statement, which says what's the action again, but now it's, what is it, details, is it list, is it delete? And then what happens here? Whatever it takes for me to get the data for the details, and then they include the appropriate view, probably employee details. Often my views have the same names as the actions, just to save me confusion. This isn't confusing enough. Inside here, there's another default. Just in case it starts with employee, that's cool, but you misspelled details, or it starts with employees, but you add save and it's not there yet. It's good for testing. It made it all the way down there. Look, it says employee save. That's what I asked for. Cool. Now I can start writing code. Just to make sure everything's connected right away. This code is stored in a file called cases. I call them cases files. That's my word because it's my technique. And if you don't want to put them in the model folder, you can put them in the cases folder. That's up to you. All the cases start with the same name. If I was in the trips cases file, then I would have all the trip stuff here. Notice there's a requirement statement. If I'm going to be dealing with employee stuff, I probably want the employee functions. That's what those are. Aren't you glad I'm recording? This is also just the beginning. A lot of it, this is a big, huge overview. We're going to come back to it and back to it because we keep building as we go. But what I used to do in the past is not include these cases files and then put them in when things got complicated. I'm just going to start using them pretty much right away. All right, let's break there. When we come back, we'll start talking about the model.